really want to welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. And what we're going to do tonight is, after the program, we're going to have a period of questions and answers that will be part of the recording, so that, and you can enable your cameras and your microphones at that point. Once the discussion of the topic tapers off, we will stop the recording and we can all adjourn to the lobby to chat. So this is a production of the New England Gilbert and Sullivan Society. Our mission is to support the appreciation of the works of these two talented men, together or separately. With venues and the performing groups temporarily shut down because of coronavirus pandemic, NEGAS is working to provide virtual programs, particularly taking the opportunity to feature material other than the operettas and material that is about the operettas rather than being the shows themselves. I'm Jacqueline Haney. I'm the program chair on the NEGAS board. We are trying to put together a program pretty much every month for the, well, till forever. We'll have virtual ones for the foreseeable future, and once we get back to being able to see each other in person, we will have in-person programming, which would be last-minute light operas and sing-alongs and sing-throughs and parties and all kinds of stuff. So if anybody does have ideas for programs, please do get in touch with me. You can contact me on Facebook or through the general email address at the new and improved negas.org website, which you should take a look at. Our next event will be November 21st, and it's going to be a viewing party of A Day at the Savoy Theater, which was a program originally presented in March by Gilbert and Sullivan Austin. NEGAS member Rafe McPhail Jr. is the artistic director of Gilbert and Sullivan Austin, and in this program, Rafe recounts the history and stories of the Savoy Theater, accompanied by slides of historical images. The narrative is interspersed with songs from the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas that premiered there at the Savoy. The second part of that program is a delightful one-act musical comedy called Mr. Jericho, which premiered there at the Savoy in 1893, during the time when Gilbert and Sullivan had fallen out over the infamous carpet quarrel. So we hope you can join us for that. And then in December, we're going to be holding a holiday program in mid-December, and details of that will be forthcoming when they are somewhat more finalized. So on with tonight's program. I've had an interesting year. All of us have had an interesting years in one way or another, but for me, one of the best things that happened in the last couple of years was that I got to know tonight's speaker, Tony Parks. Tony has been a Gilbert and Sullivan fan since the age of 8, which he says was a many years ago. He joined the Sudbury Savoyards in 1997. He has now performed in all 13 extant GNS works, several in leading roles, including the title role in The Grand Duke, and he has directed 3 of the shows for Sudbury. He knows so much about the material, and he shares it freely with affection and humor. I am delighted to introduce Tony Parks to talk tonight about The Grand Duke. Tony?
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me? I'm new at this.
We can hear you, but we can't yet see you.
Okay, how's
there
that?
We go. And now
okay.
I'm going to bow out.
Okay, and my gratitude to my wife, Beth Parks, who is the computer whiz in our house, for helping me set up and helping negotiate the vicissitudes of PowerPoint as well as Zoom. The Grand Duke, let me see. Here we go. Can you see me? I hope not. Can you hear me?
We can see the poster.
Okay. The Grand Duke, produced in 1896, was the last of Gilbert and Sullivan's joint works, and by all accounts, the least successful. The early Thespis had a shorter run, but it was always intended to be an ephemeral Christmas entertainment. Many people's first impressions of the Grand Duke have been unfavorable. The plot is more convoluted than usual, the dialogue is too wordy, and the piece gives the impression of being a parody of the Gilbert and Sullivan style, as though both partners were trying too hard to equal their past successes. And yet, there is a lot to like about the show, as anyone who has performed in it will tell you. Tonight, we're going to take a look at it with the help of some audio clips from the University of Michigan and video clips from the Sudbury Savoyards. In the book Opera for Dummies, it's stated that Gilbert and Sullivan hated each other's guts. During nearly all of their lives, they would have been surprised and indignant at such a suggestion. They were friends, though not intimates. They played tennis together, dined at each other's home, and frequently complimented each other on their achievements. But their artistic temperaments did clash. They both had healthy egos, though they expressed them in different ways. Quarrels became more intense over the years, but the earlier ones were followed fairly quickly by a reconciliation and great successes like the Mikado and the Gondoliers. The carpet quarrel was something else again. Gilbert complained that D'Oyly Carte, who was both their producer and the owner of the Savoy Theatre, was charging the partnership for items like lobby carpets that Carte, as landlord, should have paid for out of his rent. Gilbert expected Sullivan to take his side, but instead Sullivan sided with Carte, who was building a new theater for his Grand Opera. The quarrel led to a lawsuit and a 3-year breakup. The first opera after the quarrel, Utopia Limited, was expensive and only a mild success, so Gilbert and Sullivan weren't inspired to try again soon. Gilbert was also obsessed with the young soprano Nancy McIntosh, who had starred in Utopia, and insisted on her being in any new opera. Sullivan refused, which delayed the Grand Duke longer than it might have been otherwise. Nancy gave up acting eventually in favor of concert work, which removed one of the obstacles to a new G&S opera. There were several influences on the plot of the Grand Duke. In 1875, Gilbert himself wrote a 3-act farce called Tom Cobb about a man who evades his debts by pretending to be dead. It was apparently based in part on Gilbert's earlier short story, Tom Polton's Joke, involving a man who attended his own funeral, a la Tom Sawyer. Gilbert's modern biographer, Andrew Crowther, believes Tom Cobb was an important precursor of the Grand Duke. Then in 1894, a New Hampshire newspaper man named Bertram Ellis sent Gilbert a copy of an editorial he had written, speculating on what would happen if a convict were put in the electric chair, which had just been introduced in New York State, and pronounced dead, but not successfully killed. What would his legal status be? What about his wife, his property, his debts? Gilbert wrote back saying he was already working on a similar plot, but promising to pay Ellis £50 if he used his ideas. We don't know if he ever sent Ellis any money, but he went to the trouble of pasting the editorial in the notebook in which he was developing the plot of the Grand Duke. There was also a short story, not by Gilbert, The Duke's Dilemma, published in a magazine in 1853, in which a penniless Grand Duke hires a troupe of actors to play his courtiers, making him look successful enough to claim the hand of a wealthy princess. In the 1880s, that story was adapted into a comic opera called The Prima Donna. Interestingly, the show's working title was The Grand Duke, but it was changed because there had recently been another play by that name. Reviewers of the Gilbert and Sullivan Grand Duke pointed out its resemblance to these earlier works, though Gilbert denied any conscious borrowing. The plot got increasingly complicated as Gilbert worked on it, introducing new threads without discarding or resolving older ones. Apparently, 3 large roles, the Grand Duke Rudolph himself, the Prince of Monte Carlo, and his daughter the Princess, were reduced in size when Gilbert learned that 3 of his old stars, George Grossmith, Richard Temple, and Jesse Bond, would be unavailable. The leading soprano role of Julia Jellicoe wasn't in Gilbert's original plot sketches. He may have added it after he became aware of the Hungarian performer Ilka Palme, who sang and acted well but spoke English with a Middle European accent. Gilbert's typically topsy-turvy solution to this was to make her the only English member of a German theatrical company who was presumably speaking German with an English accent. The Grand Duke's name was originally Wilhelm. At the last minute, it became Rudolph, and other minor changes were made to avoid offending Kaiser Wilhelm and his family, who were friends of Sullivan's and had close ties to the British royal family. Opening night reviews of the Grand Duke were mixed. It didn't help that D'Oyly Carte had recently revived the Mikado, prompting comparisons of the new opera with the most popular of the series. Sullivan's score was generally praised, but Gilbert was perceived as trying to stretch good ideas too thin and employing some of his old tricks once too often. Sullivan left for Monte Carlo 3 days after the opening. Gilbert had to make any changes on his own. Normally, the partners would spend the week or so after opening night tweaking the show. Gilbert cut 3 songs from the second act. 2 of the songs were among the best in the show, and the third was Rudolph's entire part in Act 2. The show ran only 4 months in London, though it toured in repertory for a year. D'Oyly Carte put the Mikado right back on stage immediately. The Grand Duke was Gilbert and Sullivan's only financial failure. Although Gilbert didn't share in the losses, he was suspicious of D'Oyly Carte's financial management after the carpet quarrel, and he refused a partnership agreement similar to their older one, and he sold his rights in the show to Carte for a flat fee of £5,000. So while Carte and Sullivan lost money, Gilbert made a little. The opera was given short shrift by most critics in the first half of the 20th century. A couple of quotes. An author named H.M. Walbrook in 1922, who wrote perhaps the first book-length analysis of Gilbert's work. He says of the Grand Duke, "It is never mentioned. Even of those who saw it, the majority have forgotten it or remember it only as a vastly dull affair of which the less said the better. Its libretto was as cold as the snows of the Jungfrau, without a touch of their beauty. Even Sullivan, with all his joie de vivre, could not breathe life into it." And then in 1928, Thomas Dunhill wrote the first book-length analysis of Sullivan's work on the operas. He said, "In justice to Sullivan's memory as well as Gilbert's, it is to be hoped that the Grand Duke will never be heard again." One of the few positive reviews of the Grand Duke during this period was given in 1940 by Edmund Rickett and Benjamin Hoagland, who were authors of a how-to book called Let's Do Some Gilbert and Sullivan. They had recently directed the show for the Blue Hill Troupe of New York City. They admitted that the dialogue and some of the lyrics were far from first-rate Gilbert, but they were effusive about the score, writing, "Sullivan shows no falling off either in form or spirit." They praised his melodies, harmonies, modulations, and developments, and wrote that much of the score represented Sullivan at his best. The Grand Duke musically is the enchanting swan song of a great composer of light opera, and as such should not be allowed to lapse into oblivion. End of quote. Nevertheless, it took another generation for the show to begin coming into its own. The first recordings of the Grand Duke appeared in the 1960s. Most were made by fairly high-level amateur groups, but the BBC produced an uncut version with professional singers as part of a series broadcasting the entire GNS canon. In 1970, a Gilbert and Sullivan conference was held at the University of Kansas, including 4 performances of the Grand Duke by the school's GNS Society. Fans and scholars from around the world attended, and interest in the show has grown steadily since then. In 1973, the University of Michigan GNS Society, UMGAS for short, produced the Grand Duke and issued what has become my favorite recording, with a music director who went on to become a Broadway conductor. I'll be playing some tracks from that recording. In 1975, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company marked the centennial of Trial by Jury by presenting all 13 surviving operas in chronological order, including their first ever revivals of Utopia Limited and the Grand Duke. Grand Duke was only a concert performance, but it still created a stir, and it was followed up with the first commercial recording by a professional company. By now, most groups with the resources have tried Grand Duke at least once. It's admittedly challenging to produce. It needs more really good leads than most GNS shows. The chorus music is more sophisticated and there's more of it. Almost every group cuts the show, but there's no consensus on what to cut. But my sense is that just about everyone who has performed in it has enjoyed the experience. In modern critiques of the Grand Duke, the libretto is treated even-handedly, not an utter failure as a Gilbert work, but not as coherent as Iolanthe or the Mikado. Much of its problematic nature is surely due to the partners' estrangement. They didn't critique each other's work the way they used to. At their peak, they demanded revisions and even total rewrites of songs and scenes from each other. The Grand Duke is not only uneven in quality, but overlong and overwordy, particularly the dialogue. The score is widely considered one of Sullivan's better ones. One reason the opera was condemned by earlier critics is that they were reading the libretto without hearing the music. Sullivan is often praised for branching out into continental European style and being more daring with his harmonies. Some modern quotes. Max Keith Sutton, writing for the Kansas Symposium in 1970, he wrote that the theme is the way social roles can obscure a person's sense of identity. Actors become politicians, politicians become actors. Quote, perhaps it reminds us of how showmanship has become a requirement for political success, whether for the demagogue in the stadium or the persona in makeup who projects his rehearsed humanity into a TV camera. In this country, at least, it may remind us of how actors really do become governors or senators, if not grand dukes. End of quote. Sutton finds parallels with the comedies of Aristophanes and with fertility ritual, with Rudolph as the old king who must be killed to defeat winter, and Ludwig as the lord of misrule, presiding over a day of debauchery. Sutton also notes the constant attention to literal games played with cards and the roulette wheel, which keeps the opera from being overly grim. In 1972, Peter Klein wrote a book on Gilbert and Sullivan production and said the Grand Duke is more of a farce than a satire. It's akin to theater of the absurd, and he theorizes that Gilbert's audience wasn't ready for it. In the opera, Klein says, role-playing is carried to extremes that altogether break the bonds of rationality. Once the actors take over the country, art replaces life, and a kind of reality is established that it has its own gratuitous rationality. The existentialist, realizing that the world has no meaning except the one he gives it, is prefigured in this plot. The world indeed acquires a meaning. It is absurd, but in an absurd world, one meaning is as good as another. And in 2001, Gaydon Wren wrote a book, A Most Ingenious Paradox, which is a lit crit analysis of all the operas. He quoted Sutton from the Kansas conference, speaking of the Grand Duke's calling attention to its own artifice. Wren goes further with this thread, calling the opera an example of meta-theater, that is, theater about theater, and comparing it with Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author. Wren gives examples of breaking the fourth wall throughout the show and points out that 2 groups in the opera are made up of actors playing actors, Ernest Dumkopf's theatrical company and the Prince of Monte Carlo's entourage. Everyone seems to agree that the themes and the overall atmosphere of the show are more important than the plot. The Seattle Gilbert and Sullivan Society in 1999 decided that the show is a screwball comedy, and they played it like a 1930s Marx Brothers movie. Ludwig was the young collegiate hero in Argyle sweater. Rudolph was Groucho playing Hitler. The Baroness was Margaret Dumont. Julia was a Marlene Dietrich type in pantsuit and beret. Several critics have pointed out the resemblance of the Grand Duke, Gilbert and Sullivan's last opera, to Thespis, their first. Both plots involve a troupe of actors taking on more or less political roles. In Thespis, they assume the identities of the gods of Olympus, who govern the affairs of men on earth. In the Grand Duke, they take over an entire country, albeit a small one. Consciously or not, Gilbert has come full circle and ended where he began. Another smaller circle is evident in that the Grand Duke is the only Gilbert and Sullivan opera to end with a reprise of its own opening number. Now for the plot. Some people have complained that they've had trouble following the plot, and so I've boiled it down to essentials. First, I'll give you the elevator plot, and then we'll work our way through the show with some musical examples. The elevator plot, as in elevator pitch, in the world of business, if you're trying to sell something, whether it's a product or an idea, the rule is you should be able to describe it in the space of an elevator ride. So here it is. In the tiny Grand Duchy of Pfennig-Habpfennig, duels are fought with playing cards to avoid bloodshed. An actor named Ludwig legally kills first his producer, then the Grand Duke, and inherits their responsibilities. Eventually, he finds himself married or engaged to 4 women at once. That's it, one man with 4 wives. Now for the more detailed plot. As a reminder, the audio examples are taken from the wonderful 1973 recording by the University of Michigan G&S Society. The video clips are from the 2006 production by the Sudbury Savoyards, who will be presenting the Grand Duke again as soon as conditions permit. The place is Speisesaal, which is German for dining hall. It's the capital city of the Grand Duchy of Pfennig-Halbpfennig, which of course means penny halfpenny or 1.5 pence. The time, the year is 1750, before the unification of Germany, when there were dozens of little states like this. Act 1 takes place in the market square. Both of the sets were very elaborate in the original production and got rave reviews. Ernest Dummkopf's theatrical company is celebrating the upcoming wedding of Ludwig, their leading comedian, and Lisa, a soubrette, hereinafter known as wife number 1. We learn that the company is part of a conspiracy to overthrow Rudolph, the sickly and miserly Grand Duke, and elect Ernest, the manager, in his place. Conspirators identify themselves to one another by eating a sausage roll.
By the mystic regulation of our dark association, now you open conversation with another kindred soul. You must eat a sausage roll. You must eat a sausage roll, a sausage roll. If one eats another, that's a sign that he's a brother. Each may fully trust the other. It is quaint and it is droll, but it's curious on the whole. Very curious on the whole. It's an easy kind of tasty, which perhaps a judgment hasty might consider rather tasty. Wants to scoop without disguise. It's one favorite in our eyes. It's one favorite in our eyes. But when you've got 6 months feeding, as we have on this 16, bilious food is no ill breeding. And these repulsive ties are offended gorgeous rise. These repulsive ties are offended gorgeous rise. Gorgeous rise. By the mystic regulation of the dark association, there you go.
Ernest, the manager, feels ready to take on the duties of ruling a small country because for 10 years he has ruled a theatrical company. As he says, a man who can do that can rule anything.
Were I a king in very truth, and had a son, a guileless youth, in probable succession, to teach him patience, teach him tact, how promptly in a fix to act, he should adopt in point effect a manager's profession. To that condition he should stoop, despite a two-born mother, with 8 more spinsters in his troop, all jealous of each other, all jealous of each other. Oh, the man who can rule the theatrical, each member a genius in some of them, and manage to humor the early and late, can govern this time he's made. Both A and B rehearsal slight. They say they'll be all right at night. They don't go to school yet. C and E Jax must change her dress. He will attempt to square the press. He will play Romeo unless his grandmother plays Juliet. F plays the Hoynes as her right. She's played in 30 seasons, and she must show herself in tights for 2 convincing reasons. 2 very well-shaped reasons. Oh, the man who can rule the theatrical team with wheelers and leaders in order supreme, and manage and rule with the way of his men, or you're without a
Ernest is infatuated with his leading lady, Julia Jellicoe, the only English member of the company. She despises him, but if he is elected Grand Duke, she is reconciled to playing the part of his wife. Ludwig rushes in with some bad news. He ate sausage rolls with a stranger who turned out to be the Grand Duke's private detective. Everyone is convinced they'll be hanged for treason until Dr. Tannhäuser, the company lawyer, makes a suggestion. There is a century-old law about to expire that duels must be fought with playing cards to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The loser becomes legally dead, and the winner assumes all his privileges and responsibilities. This, for some reason, is the cue for a madrigal.
Strange of you, some people hold, true young fellows cross some people when they fight for both a bold. Rage of both is unconstrained. And this barbarous transaction is destroyed the satisfaction of satisfaction. Ding, 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 each is laid in churchyard mold. Strange the view some people hold. Sing thy virtues manifold, statutory human. Sing, sing, song, sing, song, song. Sing, sing, song, sing, song, song. Sort of peace to neither uses. They kindly lightly chooses and simply loses. Sing, 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 sing. Some prefer the churchyard mold. Strange the view some people hold. Strange the view some people hold. Strange the view some people hold.
The group decides that Ludwig and Ernest will fight a statutory duel. The survivor will denounce the loser to the Grand Duke as the instigator of the plot and receive a pardon. The next day, when the law expires, the dead man will come to life with a clean slate as death expunges crime. Ludwig wins the duel, ace over king, and Ernest withdraws from sight. The Grand Duke Rudolph enters with his retinue. He is about to marry the wealthy and imposing Baroness von Krakenfeld. She is his equal in stinginess, so they think they ought to be very happy together.
As our opinion we sing, it is not reprehensive to think what joys our wealth would bring. We're predisposed to do the thing upon a scale extensive. donkey.
which is not.
Oh, no, he's not.
No, he's not. That kind of donkey.
He is not.
They honestly married, and rejoice with the very merry. What we have to sing is a rational thing, it's a joy economical day. Let us be honestly married, and rejoice with the very merry. What we have to sing is a rational thing, it's a joy economical day.
But Rudolph is quite unwell, or thinks he is. And when his detective informs him of the plot against him, it sends him into a panic attack.
When you find you're a broken down critter, who is all in a tremble and twitter, with your palate unpleasantly bitter, as if you've just bitten uphill, when your legs are as thin as dividers, and you're plagued with unruly insiders, and your spine is all creepy with spiders, and you're highly gambushed in the kill. When you've got a beehive in your head and a sewing machine in each ear, and you feel that you're eating your bed, and you've got a bad headache, a headache down here. When such facts are about and the symptoms you find in your body or crowd, it's a shady lookout. You may make up your mind you had better lie down. Go at once, and lie down. When your lips are all smeary like tallow, and your tongue is decidedly yellow, with a pint of warm oil in your swallow, and a pound of tin tacks in your chest, when you're down in the mouth with the vapors, and all over your Morris wallpapers, black beetles are eating their capers, and crawly things never at rest. Crawly things. Crawly things. When you doubt if your head is your own, and you jump when an open door slams, then you've got to a state which is known to the medical world as Jim Jams. If such symptoms you find in your body or head, they're not easy to quell. You may make up your mind you are better in bed, for you're not at all well. No, you're not at all well. Not at all.
At this point, Ludwig approaches him, prepared to make a confession and receive a pardon. But when he sees Rudolph in the throes of self-pity, he makes a proposition instead. Let the two of them fight a rigged statutory duel. Ludwig will become Grand Duke for a day and bear the brunt of the plot, shielding Rudolph, who will come to life again as though nothing had happened. They summon the people, and Ludwig appears to defeat Rudolph, ace over king. But as soon as Rudolph has withdrawn, Ludwig revives the statutory dual law for another century, making himself Grand Duke for life. Then, to his surprise, Julia Jellicoe claims him in marriage, as her contract requires her to play the leading female part no matter who the man is. That makes her wife number 2 for Ludwig. Lisa, wife number 1, withdraws in tears, and the others celebrate Ludwig's coming reign as Act 1 ends. Act 2 takes place in the Grand Ducal Palace, beginning with a Greek procession into the Great Hall. The actors have changed into their Troilus and Cressida costumes, and Ludwig tops it off with a Louis XIV wig. Ludwig, who is now paired with Julia, tries to persuade her to be a submissive wife, but she prefers to play a more flamboyant part, ready to stab any potential rival. Ludwig says, "I wouldn't stab her. It's been done to death."
Now, Julia, come consider it from this dainty point of view. A timid, tender, feminine gender brought to coyly coo. Yet silent seeking, seldom speaking till she's spoken to. A comfy, cozy, rosy, posy, innocent ingenuity. A party you're suited to give the deuces to. A sweet, oh Jiminy, niminy, himiny, innocent ingenue.
I'm much obliged to you. I don't think that would do.
A sweet, oh Jiminy, niminy, himiny, innocent ingenue.
You forget my special magic in the high dramatic sense. Lies in situations tragic, undeniably intense. As I justify promotion in the histrionic art, I'll submit to you my notion.
to see your notion of a first-rate part.
I have a rival. Frenzy thrilled, I find you both together. My heart stands still, with horror chilled, hard as the millstone nether. Then softly, slyly, snaily, snaky, creepy, crawly, crazy, fakey, I track her on her homeward way, as panther tracks her fated prey. I believe her suck my throat! The lily-white laughing leman, on her agonized gaze I gloat, with the glee of a dancing demon. My rival she, I have no doubt of her, and so I hold on, till the breath is out of her. Till the breath is out of her! And then, remorse, oh cold, unpleasant cause, above, that lifeless form I gaze upon, that face still warm, yet weirdly wan, those eyes of glass I contemplate, and then, alas, too late, I find she is your aunt. Then, mad, with fancies wild, chimerical, now sorrowful, silent, sad, now a horrible but whether I'm sad or whether I'm glad, mad. Yes, calls for the resources of a high glass heart, and satisfies my notion of a first-rate heart, and satisfies my notion of a
At this point, the Baroness von Krakenfeld reappears, ready for her wedding to Rudolph. When the actors inform her that Ludwig has defeated Rudolph and is now Grand Duke, the Baroness, who knows all about statutory duels, claims Ludwig as her husband, since he has taken on all Rudolph's responsibilities. For those keeping score, that makes her wife number 3. She is all for celebrating with the best champagne, as long as someone else is buying.
Come bumpers I ever so many, and then if you will many more. This wine doesn't cost us a penny, goes bombery 74. For wine is a true panacea for every conceivable ill. When you cherish the soothing idea that somebody else pays the bill. For wine is a pleasure that's all, when after a table you sit, for you're thinking each drop you swallow has cost you a penny bit. So look
wife number 2 is crestfallen, but powerless to alter things.
So ends my dream. So fades my vision fair of a home, distraction and despair. My cherished dream, the ducal throne to share. That aim supreme has faded into air. All is dark song, all is dreaming, broken promise blighted, sad and sorry, weak and death of friend, death of foe. Shall I call upon thee? No. I will go on living. How sad and sorry and fearing, sad and sorry, weak and fearing, sad and sorry, weak and fearing. I will go on living, sad and sorry, weak and No, 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 no. No, no. Tomorrow the sun may be shining. Tomorrow be kind. Tomorrow to be
Shortly after this, Ernest, who's legally dead, and Julia meet by chance. He begs her to flee the country with him, but she draws the line at marrying a technical ghost. As if all this weren't complicated enough, in comes the Prince of Monte Carlo, with half a dozen seedy actors playing noblemen, and his daughter, the princess, to whom Rudolph was betrothed in infancy. They are introduced by a herald.
Approaching upon our joy encroaching, some rascal come approaching, who's heard that wine we're broaching. Who made us be?
Who made us be?
Who made us be?
Who made us be?
Who is he?
Who is he? Who is he?
The Prince of Monte Carlo from Mediterranean water has come here to bestow on you. They've paid off all they owe as every statesman oughta. That Prince of Monte Carlo and his beautiful daughter.
The Prince of Monte Carlo
From Mediterranean water
has come here to bestow
on you his beautiful
daughter. They paid off all they owe.
as every statesman oughta. That Prince of Monte Carlo
And his beautiful daughter.
That Prince of Monte Carlo, who is so very particular, has heard that you're also for ceremony a stickler. Therefore he lets you know, by word of mouth or regular, that Prince of Monte Carlo, who is so very particular. The Prince of Monte Carlo
From Mediterranean water
has come here to bestow on you
his beautiful daughter.
They've paid off all they owe.
As every statesman oughta.
That Prince of Monte Carlo
And his beautiful daughter.
beautiful.
The prince and princess have not claimed Rudolph until now through being too poor to travel, but the prince has recently invented roulette and has made a tidy sum from running the game. This is the cue for a song that's half in French, modeled on a Parisian song style called Café Chantant. The French portions consist of the croupier's patter, encouraging folks to place their bets.
Take my advice when deep in debt, set up a bank and play roulette. At one distrust to Golly-Lal and roll Papin, John and the Gull. A bird will stake his every franc in wild attempt to break the bank. But you may stake your life and win the bank will end by breaking a game. Als een kargas op die ettervolle with bava hvor det sjarpete. Lach, 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 le classe, le temps passe, le banque casse, rien ne va plus. Le lit est noir, impair et manque, la vive la banque. For every time the board you spin, the bank is bound to win. For every time the board you spin, the bank is bound to win. Cause me lovely game is this roulette. The little paws that grow coquette, a maiden coil numbers row, from 6 and 32 to so. Of all complexions to good lack, for some are red and some are black, and some must be extremely green, for half of them are not 19. Allo ancora casa biglietta, volo in dove voi sapete. Oula, 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 oula. Alle coule, ça roule, le temps s'écoule, rien ne va plus. Le temps s'écoule, j'impère et passe, très bien notre John avec classe. The moral say when you begin, the bank is bound to win. The moral say when you begin, the bank is bound to win. The little balls are flirting red, she flirts with black, she flirts with red. From this to that she hops about, and back to this as if in doubt. To call her thoughtless, her unkind, the child is making up her mind. For all the world, like all the rest, which they don't know will pay the best. Allo ancora casa bigliette, volo vitale, voi sapete. Oula, 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 oula. Qui perd de vie, oh comme ça dit, gagne je rien ne va plus. Tra-la-la-la, le double zéro, faut perdre ton ménable héros. Wherever it lost, the ball pops in, the bank is bound to win.
When the royals discover that Ludwig is now the Grand Duke, the princess claims him in marriage, making her wife number 4. Ludwig walks down to the footlights and asks the audience, "Would anybody else like to marry me? You, ma'am, or you, anybody. I'm getting used to it." Ludwig's problems appear insurmountable until the 2 dead men and the lawyer enter. It seems that the statutory duel act specifies that aces always count as low card. Therefore, Ludwig never defeated Ernest or Rudolph, didn't have the power to revive the law, and can go back to his normal life and marry Lisa. The other characters sort themselves out and all dance off to a quadruple wedding as the curtain falls. This concludes the formal portion of our program. Your questions and comments are welcome.
So if you would like to unmute yourself and start your video, you are welcome to come in and ask Tony questions or discuss any of this. If you are shy and would like for me to read your question out, you can send it to me in the chat and I will read it, and you can specify whether you wish to remain anonymous. I know one of the things that I was entertained with watching the clips was seeing how many people I could recognize from the Sudbury cast, having done HMS Pinafore with the group last year. Besides Tony, there's one I'm sure I recognized, and I think a couple more.
Would you like a rundown? And you're muted.
Here we all come.
Okay. Yeah, Ludwig was Dennis O'Brien. Ernest was Michael Bell. Lisa was Stephanie Mann. Julia was Kathy Legue. I played Rudolph. The Baroness was Tambry Tarleton Knox. And am I missing anybody? Of the ones
Well, there were chorus people that
yeah,
Jackie would recognize.
several chorus people who are still with us.
And Janice, of course, was in it.
It was till 2014. They moved.
Yeah, Janice was there. Laurel.
John Saul.
John Saul.
Yeah. Karen Powers.
92, I think, with that group.
Was Debbie Crane?
Meryl. For the record, I'm one of the people in a blue chitin.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you were there.
Yep, you were there.
I'm like a dark rose with a little shiny because I use my own fabric.
And Borchet?
I recognize Tom.
And Nancy Powers was there too,
Yeah.
with Karen.
Yes.
Fred Hughes.
As far as the UMGAS recording goes, you realize that was a studio recording of the performance, incorporating all of the material they had cut for the actual live performance.
Yeah,
I
it wasn't
think
totally.
it's still available from UMGAS.
Yes. I'm not sure about UMGAS, although you might try them, but it's definitely available from Chris Webster.
Oh yeah, Sounds on Sound.
Yeah, I can give you anybody who wants that UMGAS audio recording. I can give you his email.
Well, as we started getting to produce Grand Duke with Sudbury in February of 2022 now instead of 2021. Purely by coincidence, like 2 days later, I was in Big Lots.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Cool.
And spent $5 on a
Yeah.
really badly made roulette table.
Cheap at half the price.
Yes.
Tony, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks again to Beth for doing most of the behind the scenes work, putting together the presentation.
Oh, I have a question. So why was this their very last operetta? Why were there no more?
They were getting old and they were kind of burned out, not just with each other, but with the whole idea of comic opera. They each wrote a few more with other people, Sullivan more than Gilbert, and there were one or two that might have done better. I've read that the genre was kind of old hat, that audiences wanted musical comedy with lots of, very little plot and lots of spectacle, bring on the dancing girls, that sort of thing. And that they didn't want to have to think. But be that as it may, it was their last. Sullivan was only in his 50s, but he was a very sick man. And Gilbert was going through a period of severe gout, although he did recover for the last 10 years or so of his life and was a country gentleman with a big estate.
There was also
Go ahead, Janice.
Tony, one thing you might find humorous, I was at the Sing Out down in Rockville 3 years ago, I guess it was, and they did the full performance of Grand Duke, and when they got to the opening chorus of that crew, they actually subtitled it in Greek.
Sorry, I missed the punchline.
Yeah, they subtitled the second act opening chorus in Greek when they got to the Greek lyrics.
Those of you folks in Boston, it's kind of interesting to know, and I don't know that it's widely known. MIT used to have a student theatrical organization called Tech Show. I don't think it's still there. But somewhere around the turn from the 19th to 20th century, I don't recall the specific date.
I think it was 1901.
Did the US premiere of Grand Duke.
Yep.
Oh. Did you say 2001?
No,
1901.
Oh, 19. I was going to say that couldn't be. Okay. Yeah, that sounds better.
I think that MIT also did a production of Grand Duke around the year 2001, perhaps for the 100th anniversary of premiere.
I think so.
And it was a really long one because they included everything that had ever been cut. I own it on DVD somewhere.
Well, the recording that Tony has also includes everything from the original performance.
Well, the Act 1 finale is cut down in that one. There is a there is now a, on YouTube, you can find the audio of the Mount Oriad Society, which was the University of Kansas Society.
That was an uncut version too, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was seriously uncut. They found some lines that even the guy who put together the first Night Gilbert and Sullivan book missed.
Yeah, I don't know I don't know if it's complete on YouTube, but I got an audio tape transfer from the discs back in 1971, and I've converted that to digital, so I can make that available, I suspect, if someone wants it.
Sure. Also, the BBC did it twice, in '66 and in '89. The first one, I think, is a little better dramatically, and the second one is a little better musically. And I think they're both available now on YouTube.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider Mount Oriad to be even in the same league with the University of Michigan recording.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as
it was
as
a live recording.
Yeah, it was interesting in that it was a live recording and that they included everything they could find, the music, lyrics, and dialogue.
Take that off.
How long a performance would that have been?
Well, it's you can time it. You can look at the time on YouTube.
I think it's about 2.5 hours.
Yeah, people have said it's a 3-hour show. I don't think so. The uncut or all but uncut versions tend to go about 1 hour and 20 minutes for Act 1 and just over an hour for Act 2. So it isn't really longer than Yeoman. It just feels like it because it's not quite as cohesive.
Yeah.
It was on 3 discs. It was on 3 vinyl discs.
With dialogue.
It was transferred for me to reel-to-reel tape, 1,200 feet tape, so 1 hour per side, and it ran a little more than one tape. So I'd say about 2.5 hours in the Mount Oriad version.
Sound over here.
Yeah, that's not that bad.
Depends on how good the show is.
Well, yeah, I mean, just as a length.
Well, you have to keep up the pace. It is a screwball comedy, and it's a farce. It has to be played like one.
And on the other hand, if nobody's applauding, that doesn't lengthen things.
There's applause in the Mount Oriad recording.
So one of my favorite Grand Duke stories it was not really Grand Duke. It was when Negas got invited to the sneak preview of Topsy Turvy. And so it's a Negas story as well as a Grand Duke story. In the middle of watching it, the audience started giggling. And as less of a GNS fanatic at the time than others, I leaned over to Tony and said, "What's funny?" And he said, "The music." You want to?
Yeah, it was the scene where I think it was the scene where Gilbert's at the dentist, but in any event, the underscoring was an instrumental version of When You Find You're a Broken Down Critter. So what other audience would have recognized a bit from the Grand Duke, and that was the night when half the audience, being Negas people, sang Hail Poetry before the film started, probably making the other half wonder what they had gotten themselves into.
What sort of cult?
Right.
And humming along in places and joining in with the chorus occasionally. It was a great time. It was wonderful.
Janice, I can't help but notice you're sitting in a sleeveless dress and wearing our fleeces and our flannels. And so a little bit jealous. Yes.
You're
perfect.
Summer. I'm on the California coast and it's been a cool summer. And now we're into fall. And all of a sudden, like this last week, we had started hitting the 90s. Since we had barely made the 80s before, I could say this is like Indian summer, I suppose.
Here it's been up and down as usual in New England. Wait a couple of days and it's been going from the 50s to the 70s.
Right.
I keep a watch on what Boston temperatures are because I have a son in Medford. And I'm kind of checking out, okay, what would he be doing? And then I don't think he checks on me though.
Well, it's been a beautiful fall. It really has.
Yeah, well, the colors are great.
Sorry to get you off topic.
Oh, I have a Duke related question. So one of my
Yeah.
favorite things about Gilbert and Sullivan is the unique takes that each director comes up with. I absolutely love watching what this cast will do differently. Someone mentioned Greek subtitles in the Act One opening, and what I thought was hilarious was in the MIT production, the Grand Duke at the beginning of Act Two, he acknowledged that he was no longer in this play, so he took a seat in the audience and decided who's going to watch it. What are some of the fun things you've seen in productions of Grand Duke?
Well, MIT, I think it might have been the 2001 production. Julia, in her long song about "Oh, I'm sad," and then looking forward to tomorrow. The scene takes place in the dressing room of the theatrical company, and when she gets to tomorrow, she grabs a red wig, kind of like Annie, off the shelf and puts it on her head for a moment to sing tomorrow.
Often wondered if Annie's song wasn't somewhat inspired by that somehow.
I doubt it. It's a common word, but you never know.
Well, the feeling is similar too, not just the word.
Well, it's certainly true that people who write musicals tend to be familiar with GNS.
Oh yeah. Any other?
I've heard said that Gilbert and Sullivan are the fathers of the modern day Broadway musical. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
That's great.
All of the writers of modern musicals in the 30s and the 40s were intimately familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yeah. And when asked, they acknowledged their dad. I think it was the big hit that Pinafore made in the States shortly after its London opening, that apparently it had a lot of influence on American musical theater at the time, that it was just a cut above and everybody wanted to do something that good.
And of course that premiered in Boston too.
Oh, right, before New York. It was an unauthorized production, but it did. The Boston producer did beat New York.
Yeah. Well, D'Oyly Carte didn't come over for Pinafore at all. He came over for Pirates.
Well, but they put on Pinafore while they were rehearsing Pirates.
Yeah, that was after the horse was out of the barn, though.
Yeah. There's a point where everyone was putting on Pinafore.
Right. Yeah, there was a newspaper account that counted up however many dozens there were and said companies formed after 6 p.m. yesterday are not included in this total.
Any other Grand Duking? I'm going to turn my recording off and we can talk about the weather, as it were.
We've already done that.
Yes, well.
Yeah.
A little bit.